Welcome to Abomination Realm, the place where shadows linger and the forgotten horrors of history are dragged back into the light. Tonight, we descend into the brutal legacy of one of the most feared and controversial figures of the modern age, a man born into poverty, who clawed his way to the throne of a fractured nation, a dictator who bathed in wealth while his people starved, a master of fear who ruled through torture, war, and blood. This is the story of Saddam Hussein. From the dusty streets of Tikrit to the golden halls of power in Baghdad, from genocide and chemical warfare to war with the world and a final descent into a cold, concrete grave. This is not just a biography, it is a journey into tyranny, deception, and destruction, a tale of how power can turn a man into a myth and a nation into a nightmare. So light your candles, lock your doors, and prepare yourselves, because history is far more terrifying. Hussein was born on April 28, 1937, in the small village of Al-Auja, just outside the city of Tikrit in northern Iraq. His entry into the world was marked by tragedy and abandonment. His father either died or disappeared before he was born, and his older brother died shortly thereafter. His mother, Subha Tufa al-Musallat, was devastated by grief and nearly aborted Saddam. She attempted to give him away to another family. Rejected, she sent him to live with his uncle, Khairallah Talfa, a former Iraqi army officer and ardent Arab nationalist. From this man, Saddam absorbed early seeds of ideology and vengeance. Saddam's early years were defined by hardship and violence. He grew up in a mud brick house among impoverished families with limited education and few prospects. As a child, he rarely smiled, and those who knew him described a quiet, brooding boy prone to bursts of rage. His uncle, a disciplinarian steeped in anti-British and pan-Arab sentiments, shaped Saddam's worldview. The boy learned early that power was taken, not given, that fear could be more powerful than love. At 10 years old, Saddam ran away from his abusive stepfather and rejoined his uncle in Baghdad. This was his first journey from the margins of society toward its center. In Baghdad, he enrolled in school and became politically active. He struggled with academics but was relentless in ambition. In 1957, at the age of 20, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a political movement that fused Arab nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism. The Ba'athists dreamed of a united Arab world led by strongmen who could purge corruption, colonial influence, and Western domination. In 1959, Saddam was selected to participate in a Ba'athist plot to assassinate Iraqi Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim, who had taken power a year earlier in a military coup. The ambush failed. Saddam was wounded in the leg and fled the country, first to Syria, then to Egypt. While in exile, he studied law and continued to build connections within the pan-Arab political network. The attempt marked him for life. He had drawn blood in the name of revolution and survived. He returned to Iraq in 1963 when the Ba'ath briefly seized power after a successful coup. But internal divisions within the Ba'ath Party quickly led to their ousting, and Saddam was imprisoned. He spent the next years in confinement where he read voraciously law, history, Stalinist strategy, and built a network of loyal allies. In 1967, he escaped from prison in dramatic fashion, reportedly hiding in a water tanker to flee captivity. He went underground, consolidating power within the Ba'athist ranks and preparing for a return to prominence. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party launched another coup, this time successfully, and established a long-term grip on Iraq. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam's relative and mentor, became president. But Saddam was the real force behind the curtain. He controlled the intelligence apparatus, internal security, and party organization. Through assassinations, surveillance, and torture, he neutralized rivals and built a vast system of loyalty and fear. Over the next decade, Saddam expanded his power. He oversaw massive industrialization, education reform, and economic growth fueled by Iraq's oil wealth. He negotiated oil nationalization, brought literacy campaigns to rural areas, and modernized infrastructure. These achievements, however, were used as tools of control. Every advancement was tied to Ba'athist propaganda, every success to the glory of Saddam Hussein. In July 1979, al-Bakr resigned under pressure and Saddam assumed the presidency. Almost immediately, he convened an emergency meeting of Ba'ath party leaders. In a televised session, Saddam read a list of names, accusing them of treason and plotting a coup. Men were dragged out screaming. Some were forced to execute their fellow party members to prove loyalty. This purge solidified Saddam's grip on the state. The age of the dictator had begun. Saddam cultivated a godlike image. Statues were erected across cities. His portraits were painted in schools, mosques, and public squares. He wore Western suits one day and traditional Bedouin robes the next, presenting himself as both modernizer and tribal chief. School children chanted his name. The media became an instrument of his mythology. But Saddam was not content with ruling Iraq alone. He wanted to lead the Arab world. In 1980, he invaded neighboring Iran, hoping to seize territory and assert dominance over a post-revolutionary, chaotic Islamic republic. He believed the West and much of the Arab world would support him. The Iran-Iraq War became one of the longest and most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. It lasted 8 years. The front lines were static and bloody, reminiscent of World War I. Iraq used chemical weapons, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against Iranian troops and, in some cases, civilians. International condemnation was muted. The West, particularly the United States and France, provided Iraq with intelligence and support, fearing the rise of Iran's Islamic Revolution more than Saddam's brutality. In 1988, Saddam turned those same weapons on his own people. During the Anfal campaign against the Kurds in northern Iraq, Iraqi forces destroyed thousands of villages, displaced hundreds of thousands, and used chemical weapons in acts of terror. The most infamous was the massacre at Halabja, where an estimated 5,000 civilians, mostly women and children, died in a single chemical attack. Thousands more were injured or sickened. The world watched, issued statements, and moved on. Flush with a sense of impunity, Saddam turned his attention south. In August 1990, he invaded Kuwait, claiming it as Iraqi territory and accusing the small nation of overproducing oil and stealing from Iraqi reserves. The global response was swift. The United Nations condemned the invasion. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, assembled a coalition and launched Operation Desert Storm in early 1991. The war was short, but devastating. Coalition forces bombarded Iraq's military infrastructure, destroying roads, bridges, and communication systems. In just over a month, Iraqi forces were driven out of Kuwait. However, coalition troops stopped short of removing Saddam from power. The dictator remained, battered but alive. What followed was a decade of pain. Uprisings in southern and northern Iraq were crushed with savage force. The Shia and Kurdish populations were again subjected to mass killings. The West imposed punishing economic sanctions. Iraq's middle class collapsed. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Children died of malnutrition. While his people suffered, Saddam built new palaces, filled them with gold, and maintained his cult of personality. He continued to defy UN weapons inspectors, leading to ongoing suspicion about weapons of mass destruction. In 2003, the United States, under President George W. Bush, launched a second invasion of Iraq. Citing the threat of Saddam's supposed weapons programs and links to terrorism, American forces swept into the country. Baghdad fell within weeks. Statues of Saddam were toppled. His regime crumbled, but Saddam himself was gone. For 9 months, Saddam remained a fugitive. He moved from safe house to safe house, relying on a shrinking circle of loyalists. On December 13, 2003, U.S. forces found him hiding in a camouflaged underground hideout near Tikrit. He was unkempt, bearded, and armed with a pistol he never fired. Saddam was placed on trial by the newly formed Iraqi government. The trial focused primarily on the Dujail massacre, in which 148 Shia men and boys were executed after a failed assassination attempt on Saddam's motorcade. The trial was criticized for its irregularities, but it concluded with a guilty verdict. On December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was hanged. The execution was filmed on a cell phone and leaked to the public. It showed guards taunting him moments before the trapdoor fell. The dictator died with a defiant sneer on his face, but his death did not bring the closure many had hoped for. Iraq descended into chaos. The disbanding of the Iraqi military and purge of Ba'athist officials left a vacuum that would give rise to violent insurgency. Many former regime loyalists would eventually join or lead what would become the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. Saddam's palaces remain, many looted or in ruins. His face no longer adorns the walls, but his legacy is etched in the blood of a nation. His life was a paradox of progress and destruction, order and savagery. To some, he was a strong man who held a fractured country together. To others, he was a tyrant who turned Iraq into a graveyard of dreams. He ruled through fear. He silenced millions with death. And though his body now lies in a tomb in his home village, the damage he wrought continues to ripple through history. Saddam Hussein did not simply rise and fall. He exploded across the 20th century like a sandstorm of steel and shadow, leaving behind a legacy too dark to forget. Warning: the following footage may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Muammar Gaddafi was born in 1942 near Sirte, a desert region in western Libya, to a Bedouin family of modest means. His upbringing was traditional and deeply influenced by Arab culture and Islamic values. As a child, he experienced the remnants of Italian colonialism and the turbulent rise of Libyan nationalism, which shaped his worldview. Gaddafi was particularly inspired by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and his ideals of pan-Arabism, anti-imperialism, and Arab socialism. In the late 1950s, Gaddafi entered the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi. He later trained abroad in the United Kingdom, where he reportedly grew increasingly critical of Western culture and influence. By the mid-1960s, he was a young army officer with revolutionary ideas and a growing network of loyal supporters inside the Libyan military. On September 1, 1969, at the age of 27, Muammar Gaddafi led a bloodless coup that overthrew Libya's monarch, King Idris I. The king had been abroad receiving medical treatment when the coup took place. The Revolutionary Command Council, RCC, led by Gaddafi, took control of the government. They abolished the monarchy, declared Libya a republic, and began a radical program of reform. Gaddafi's new government expelled foreign military forces, nationalized the oil industry, and redirected Libya's wealth into education, infrastructure, and social welfare programs. He positioned himself as a staunch anti-imperialist and pan-Arab leader. He promoted unity among Arab nations, even proposing unification with countries like Egypt, Syria, and Tunisia, although these efforts repeatedly failed. In the 1970s, Gaddafi introduced his political philosophy known as the Third International Theory, outlined in his Green Book. It rejected both Western-style democracy and Soviet-style communism. Instead, Gaddafi proposed a system of direct democracy managed through local people's congresses. In theory, power was in the hands of the people. In reality, Gaddafi retained absolute control through a complex web of military, intelligence, and revolutionary committees. Despite officially holding no government office after 1979, Gaddafi ruled Libya as its undisputed leader, adopting the titles of Brother Leader and Guide of the Revolution. He cultivated a cult of personality, appearing in state media in flamboyant outfits, sunglasses, and military uniforms adorned with medals. His face appeared on currency, billboards, and in schools. Gaddafi used Libya's vast oil wealth to modernize the country. Infrastructure projects, such as roads, schools, hospitals, and the Great Man-Made River, the world's largest irrigation project, were launched. Literacy rates and life expectancy improved. But alongside these developments, repression intensified. Political dissent was crushed. Opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Libya's internal security forces created a climate of fear, and the judiciary served the regime rather than justice. In the 1980s, Gaddafi became increasingly confrontational on the world stage. He was accused of sponsoring terrorist groups across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Libya provided support to the Irish Republican Army, IRA, Palestinian militants, and various insurgent movements. In 1986, after Libya was linked to a bombing in West Berlin that killed American soldiers, the United States launched airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi, killing Gaddafi's adopted daughter and injuring several others. The most infamous act associated with Gaddafi's regime came in 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people. Libyan intelligence operatives were accused of planting the bomb. For years, Gaddafi denied responsibility, but in 2003 his government officially accepted culpability and paid over $2.7 billion in compensation to victims' families, though Gaddafi continued to deny personal involvement. By the early 2000s, Gaddafi began a surprising rebranding campaign. Isolated and facing economic hardship due to years of sanctions, he agreed to abandon Libya's weapons of mass destruction program and sought to normalize relations with the West. He met with world leaders including Tony Blair, Nicolas Sarkozy, and even President George W. Bush's administration. Libya was removed from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism in 2006. But beneath the surface, Gaddafi's rule remained authoritarian. Corruption flourished, and wealth was concentrated among his family and loyal elites. His sons held powerful positions, often acting as diplomats, security heads, or business magnates. The promised direct democracy never materialized, and popular frustration simmered beneath the surface. In 2011, the Arab Spring swept through North Africa and the Middle East. Protests erupted in Libya, initially calling for political reform, but quickly escalating into a nationwide uprising. Gaddafi responded with deadly force. His security forces fired on demonstrators, bombed rebel-held cities, and vowed to crush opposition house by house. In response to the regime's brutality, the United Nations authorized military intervention. NATO launched an air campaign to protect civilians and support rebel forces. Over the next several months, Gaddafi's grip on power crumbled. Key cities fell to rebels, and his own inner circle began to defect. On October 20, 2011, after being captured near his hometown of Sirte, Muammar Gaddafi was brutally beaten and killed by rebel fighters. Video footage of his death shocked the world and marked the end of his 42-year rule. After his death, Libya descended into chaos. Rival militias, political factions, and extremist groups vied for control. The power vacuum left by Gaddafi's fall contributed to years of civil war, regional instability, and the rise of ISIS in North Africa. Gaddafi's legacy remains divisive. To some, he was a tyrant who oppressed his people and destabilized the world. To others, especially in parts of Africa, he was a visionary who challenged Western dominance and invested in Pan-African unity. Under his rule, Libya achieved a high standard of living relative to its neighbors, but it came at the cost of freedom and basic human rights. Muammar Gaddafi's life was a study in contradictions. Revolutionary and dictator, modernizer and despot, nationalist and global agitator. His story is a stark reminder of how power, ideology, and control can shape a nation, and how their collapse can leave a country fractured for years to come. To another edition of Abomination Realm's Tyrants of History. Today we explore the rise, reign, and violent end of one of Europe's last Stalinist dictators, Nicolae Ceausescu, the self-proclaimed genius of the Carpathians and the architect of a nation's suffering. In the final days of the Cold War, Romania teetered on the edge of collapse. Once full of post-war hope, it had become one of the most repressive regimes in Europe. At its center stood Nicolae Ceausescu, who ruled Romania with absolute power for over 2 decades. His ascent began in March 1965, when he became General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party after the death of Gheorghe Dej. By 1967, he also held the title of President of the State Council. At first, Romanians were cautiously optimistic. Ceausescu seemed youthful, energetic, and perhaps more open than his predecessor. In 1968, he gained international admiration for denouncing the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Western nations welcomed him, offering favorable trade deals and billions in loans. For a brief moment, Romania appeared to be breaking from Moscow's shadow, but it was a mirage. Behind the scenes, Ceausescu was building a dictatorship more suffocating than anything Romania had known. In 1966, he banned abortion and contraception, forcing mandatory gynecological checks and punishing women who didn't comply. In 1971, after visiting China and North Korea, he introduced the July Theses, policies that increased censorship, centralized education, and glorified his rule. His wife, Elena, was elevated to positions of immense power, despite her lack of education. Declared a renowned scientist by the state, she was widely disliked for her cruelty and arrogance. The couple soon became the focus of a grotesque cult of personality. School children recited poems praising them. Streets, institutions, and even textbooks were remade in their honor. By the late 1970s, Ceausescu had surrounded himself with loyalists. Loyalty to the Ceausescu family became the sole path to political survival. The Securitate, Romania's secret police, enforced obedience with brutal efficiency. By 1977, there were over 400,000 informants in a country of just 21 million. People whispered in their own homes. Some turned on faucets to drown out their voices, fearing the walls had ears. Dissidents vanished. Students were interrogated. Religious leaders were silenced. Churches were demolished to make room for Ceausescu's vision of modern Romania, cold, concrete, and identical. Television was reduced to just 2 hours per evening, half of it filled with Ceausescu's speeches. Western media, music, and literature were banned. Culture became propaganda. In the 1980s, Ceausescu launched a nationwide austerity campaign to repay the country's $10 billion foreign debt. His solution? Export everything. Food, fuel, even medical supplies were redirected abroad. Supermarkets went empty, heating and electricity were cut to just a few hours a day. Hospitals ran without anesthesia, malnutrition spread, infant mortality soared. Meanwhile, the Ceausescus lived in luxury, heated villas, imported food, and global privilege. His crowning vanity project was the People's Palace in Bucharest. To build it, more than 40,000 people were displaced and entire neighborhoods were bulldozed. By the late 1980s, resistance was rising. Romanians tuned into illegal shortwave broadcasts from Radio Free Europe, the BBC, and Voice of America. Underground pamphlets, samizdat, circulated among students and intellectuals. In 1987, the Brașov Rebellion erupted. Workers demanded food and wages. The regime cracked down, but the silence had been broken. Then, in December 1989, the spark ignited in the city of Timișoara. When the Securitate tried to evict Pastor Laszlo Tőkés, crowds formed a human chain to protect him. The protest quickly grew. By December 17th, security forces opened fire on civilians. Over 90 people were killed. But instead of stopping the movement, the violence ignited a national revolution. On December 21st, Ceausescu attempted a televised rally in Bucharest. The crowd booed, chants broke out. For the first time, state television cut the broadcast. Ceausescu froze in panic. The illusion of control shattered. By December 22nd, the army had switched sides. Troops marched with protesters. Defense Minister Vasile Milea died under suspicious circumstances, officially a suicide, though many believed he was murdered for refusing to carry out Ceausescu's orders. That afternoon, Ceausescu and Elena fled by helicopter. But Romania was no longer his. Military airspace was no longer safe. The pilot faked a mechanical failure and landed near Târgoviște. The couple was captured and handed over to a local army unit. For 3 days, they were held in isolation, unaware that their regime had collapsed. On Christmas morning, December 25, 1989, a military tribunal was hastily assembled. The trial lasted just 55 minutes. Charges included genocide, abuse of power, and economic sabotage. Ceausescu refused to recognize the court. Elena hurled insults. No evidence was reviewed. No witnesses called. The verdict: death by firing squad. Immediate execution. At 2:45 p.m., they were taken into the courtyard. Both refused blindfolds. Nicolae stood defiant. Elena clung to him. The soldiers opened fire. Over 100 bullets were fired in less than 30 seconds. Their bodies lay twisted in the snow. That night, the footage was edited and broadcast on Romanian television. Within 48 hours, more than 300 million people worldwide had witnessed the fall of one of Eastern Europe's last communist tyrants. The Romanian Communist Party disintegrated overnight. Ion Iliescu, a former party insider, took power. Though elections were held in 1990, many saw Iliescu as a continuation of the old guard. In June, when students protested for full democracy, Iliescu called in miners to crush the uprising, a violent echo of the past. Economically, Romania was in ruins. Inflation soared. Factories closed. Thousands of families mourned the dead of December. Many never learned how or why their loved ones were killed. More than 3 decades later, Ceausescu's shadow still looms over Romania. The People's Palace, built from suffering, now houses the nation's parliament. Every year, on December 22nd, Romanians gather to remember the revolution. On December 25th, many still pause, not to celebrate but to reflect on what brought them to that moment. A dictator who ruled through fear, a people pushed too far, and a fall witnessed by the world. This has been Abomination Realm's Tyrants of History.
Hey guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel.
In the haunted history of the 20th century, few names echo with such dread as Fidel Castro. Born on August 13, 1926 in Oriente, Cuba, his life began not in poverty's chains but in the strange twilight between privilege and oppression. His father, Ángel Castro, had come from Spain decades earlier, not as a hero, but as a soldier sent to crush Cuba's fight for freedom. Spain lost, but Ángel remained, carving out wealth in sugar fields drenched with the sweat and blood of laborers. Fidel was born into this contradiction, the son of a landowner, yet surrounded by the wretched poverty of plantation workers, many of them immigrants scraping by in misery. His illegitimate birth was a mark of shame in a Catholic land, his childhood steeped in whispers of scandal. But where other children bent, Fidel hardened. He grew, not as a scholar, but as an athlete, his body forged like iron. He would never fade quietly into the ranks of men. Cuba itself was a nation bleeding out. American corporations ruled its economy, while mafia dons ran its nightlife. Politicians traded bribes like currency, and the people were left to rot in hunger and despair. By the time Fidel reached the University of Havana in 1945, the island was little more than a playground for foreigners and thieves. On campus, where gangs carried guns as easily as books, Castro's rage found its first outlet. He threw himself into protests, into speeches, into causes that rattled against the American empire that strangled the Caribbean. He joined movements to free Puerto Rico. He tangled with left-wing militants, whispered in the shadows of Havana. The police suspected him of murder. Whether true or not, the myth of Castro the firebrand had begun. He fled to join rebellions abroad, even leaping into shark-infested waters to escape capture during a failed uprising against the Dominican dictator Trujillo. For the first time, Fidel tasted armed insurrection, and he would never let it go. Back in Cuba, corruption deepened, and so did Castro's resolve. He studied the works of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky, his mind sharpening to a revolutionary edge. When Batista, the strong man who had once fled to Florida, seized power again in 1952, this time through a military coup, Castro abandoned peaceful reform. He would answer tyranny with blood. On July 26, 1953, he led over 100 men against the Moncada barracks. It was a massacre. Half were slaughtered, the rest captured. Fidel stood in chains before the court, yet even as the state demanded silence, he roared. His speech, "History will absolve me," transformed defeat into prophecy. He was sentenced to prison, but Batista made a mistake that would haunt him forever. He released Castro after less than 2 years. Fidel went into exile, but exile only sharpened his vision. In Mexico, he met the man who would become a global symbol of rebellion and bloodshed, Ernesto Che Guevara. Together with Raúl Castro and a small band of followers, they plotted the downfall of Batista's empire. In 1956, crammed aboard the yacht Grama, over 80 men sailed back to Cuba. Ambushed upon arrival, most were slaughtered. Only 19 survived. But among those 19 was Fidel, who vanished into the shadows of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From there, the myth began. The mountains birthed a guerrilla army. Peasants whispered his name, fighters swelled his ranks, and raids bled Batista's forces dry. By 1958, the dictator's men were deserting, disgusted by the crimes they were ordered to commit. On New Year's Eve, Batista fled into the night, stealing millions as he abandoned his island to fate. By January 1959, Fidel Castro marched triumphantly into Havana. The revolution had triumphed, but its true face was only beginning to show. At first he masked his power behind provisional governments, but soon the disguise slipped. Within weeks, ministers resigned, exiled, or vanished. By February, Fidel was prime minister, and soon he would become something far greater and far darker. The United States, once cautious, hoped to lure him into their fold. They failed to see the truth. Castro's heart was not theirs to claim. He turned to Moscow, aligning Cuba with the Soviet Union. He nationalized American property, seized industries, and cast his lot with communism. The island became a thorn of defiance in America's side, a dagger aimed at its southern throat. In 1961, the CIA unleashed exiles in the Bay of Pigs invasion, hoping to topple him in blood and fire. Instead, it was Castro's greatest victory. He crushed the invaders, personally directing the counterattack. Over 1,000 men fell into his hands, prisoners of his revolution. The humiliation of America was complete. But what came next was darker still. In 1962, Soviet missiles began to appear on Cuban soil. Nuclear warheads pointed north, capable of turning American cities into ash within minutes. The world stood on the brink. For 13 days in October, the planet trembled. Spy planes photographed the silos. American generals demanded invasion. Kennedy hesitated. Khrushchev bargained. And Castro demanded defiance until death. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with secret deals and tense retreats, but its shadow never lifted. Castro had survived again, a man born of scandal, raised among the poor, armed by fury and fire, had defied empires, stared into nuclear Armageddon, and refused to bow. He would rule Cuba with an iron fist for nearly half a century. To some, a liberator. To others, a tyrant. To the world, a symbol of defiance against the most powerful empire on earth. But one truth lingers like a specter. Fidel Castro was not merely a man, he was a force born of oppression and fueled by vengeance, a force that turned an island into the front line of the Cold War, and like all forces born of fire and blood, his shadow will never die. Fidel Castro, the former leader of Cuba, passed away on November 25, 2016 in Havana at the age of 90. The cause of death was not publicly disclosed, though it was widely attributed to natural causes following years of declining health. If you're a fan of chilling documentaries like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. It lets us know you crave more darkness from the realm. Until next time, Wanderer, we'll be waiting in the shadows.